Hello, everyone. Come on in. Welcome. I'm going to give folks probably another minute or so to hop on over from the main session into this breakout room. Excited to see some familiar faces. Welcome, welcome. We will get started in just a moment. See some folks coming into the room. Give another 30 seconds or so. Feel free to come on video if you'd like to. And we will get started very, very shortly. Okay, it looks like we have a great group in the room now. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I want to welcome all of you to Proven Actions to Advance DE&I and Build an Equitable Work Strategy on behalf of Grads of Life and America's Promise Alliance. I am so thrilled that you all are spending part of your day with us today, and just really excited to dig into this conversation. So with that, I'm going to pull up a couple of slides that we'll be walking through today, and turn it to the next slide. So my name is Laura Thompson. I'm a Senior Director of Thought Leadership and Content with Grads of Life. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a white woman in my 30s. I have short brown hair. I'm wearing a polka dot top today and coming to you from my home office, my basement office. You can see probably a small window behind me, from Baltimore, Maryland. And just delighted and honored to be with you today and excited for this conversation. I've been working with companies to really transform their hiring, retention, and advancement strategies to drive equity for over a decade now. And I currently lead our research strategy at Grads of Life, which really focuses on building the evidence base behind employment practices that drive equity. And that's what I'm so excited to discuss with you all today and share with you some of the research that we've published over the last 6 months. So for those of you who are less familiar, Grads of Life is a nonprofit initiative. Sounds like we're getting some echoes, so I would ask folks to please mute if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much. So Grads of Life is a nonprofit initiative that's mission is to close the opportunity divide in this country. And we do that by working hand in hand with companies to help them build more inclusive and equitable talent strategies. We are part of a nonprofit organization called Year Up that helps young adults, opportunity youth, get the training and skills that they need to build careers in corporate America. So that's a little bit about me and about Grads of Life. And for our session today, we really have 3 key goals. I want to spend the first part of the session really grounding us in the national context and really the new DE&I landscape and some of the key forces that are changing the way companies and employers really think about and prioritize DE&I. There's been so much change over the past couple of years. And what we're seeing is really a shift in paradigm and a new landscape around DE&I. So I want to kind of ground us there. Then I want to share an overview of some of our latest research and really dig into the way we think about building a holistic DE&I strategy that drives outcomes. And we'll double click on some of the findings from our research. And thirdly, I want to double click on 3 evidence-based actions that drive DE&I outcomes and that are particularly important for this community and really for young adults when thinking about driving success in the workforce. And we'll get to some practical tips and takeaways that you can bring back in your work as well. We want this to be an interactive session, so I invite you to please light up the chat. I know sometimes that can be kind of the most exciting part of sessions like this. So please feel free to chime in via the chat. I'll have my colleague Hiba Hassan monitoring that and monitoring for questions there. And then I will do my best to also pause throughout to get some live interaction as well. So I want to start with, again, grounding us in what really to us at Grads of Life feels like an incredibly unique moment in time. Between the COVID-19 pandemic, a national reckoning around racial justice and racial equity, an economic recession and recovery, and now unprecedented numbers of workers really rethinking their jobs and leaving their jobs. What we're seeing is really a sea change in how companies are thinking about and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've been doing this work, as I mentioned, for several decades, and we've never really seen corporate leadership prioritizing DE&I in this way and really mobilizing across the private sector to take action. And I love this quote from Ken Frazier, who I think is really a key leader in this movement. Some of you may know that Ken Frazier launched a coalition of companies in 2020 called 110, whose mission is to create 1 million career opportunities for Black talent over the next 10 years. And that coalition has grown to now 55 companies who are joining forces towards this mission. And Grads of Life is a proud partner to the 110 Coalition. And I think this quote and Ken Frazier's leadership is really a sign of the future and of CEOs taking on a much more significant role in driving racial equity and thinking about how their company can play a significant role. And so I want to unpack this a little bit more and really think about what else is driving this sea change. Why is this such a unique moment in time, and what forces are coming together to create this new paradigm? And so at Grads of Life, we really see this as the convergence of two forces. One is kind of the business imperative for DE&I, and the other is the social imperative for DE&I. And we see this as sort of the convergence of those two imperatives that's creating unique momentum and unique kind of commitments and action across the private sector. And so digging in a little bit more on the business imperative side of things, I want to share with you a couple of data points that really speak to this. And so, as I mentioned, we know that we're living through the kind of the Great Resignation, as some are calling it, and we're seeing millions of workers leaving their jobs and really rethinking that contract between kind of employee and employer. And I think what's behind some of that is absolutely kind of factors around an equitable workplace and what employees are increasingly looking for from their employers. So I want to draw your attention here to particularly the top statistic on the slide and the one on the bottom. So let's start with the one on the top, right? So 3/4 of employees and job seekers say it's important to them that their workplace, that their employer is a diverse one, right? And that their company is committed to DE&I, all those amazing things that our first group of panelists were talking about in terms of having a place where you belong and can bring your authentic self to work. So 3/4, that's a huge number, and that's according to Glassdoor. So it's undeniable that companies, in order to attract and retain talent in this day and age, have to be transparent about their commitment to DE&I. They've got to communicate with job seekers about their workforce and what it feels like, what it looks like to be part of that workforce. And then if we skip down to the bottom, right, it doesn't stop at workers. This extends to consumers as well. And so close to 90% of consumers are looking for CEOs to speak out about social issues in the way that Ken Frazier, as we just saw, has done and is continuing to do. So this is not just a business imperative from a talent perspective, but also in terms of consumer loyalty and really communicating to your customers what you're committed to in terms of a social impact, and particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we've seen similar consumer behavior in the environmental space, where consumers are looking for companies and thinking about their footprint, their environmental footprint. Now what we're seeing is consumers increasingly caring about DE&I, and companies being more transparent about what the inside of those four walls look like and feel like. And so that, again, painting the picture of the business imperative, right? And then on the other side of things is the social imperative. And so we all know on this call that we're living with historic levels of inequality, right? Where the unemployment rate among Black Americans is 2 times that of white Americans. And that has led to an enormous wealth gap. And so we've got this cycle of unemployment and wealth gap. And I think what's really interesting about coalitions like 110 is that they are really for the first time mobilizing companies in the private sector to take on some of these statistics. So 110, right, is not just about the business need. It's really in its mission setting out to make an impact on these numbers and change the system in a really meaningful way and over a long period of time, right? So 110 is a 10-year goal. And I think that's really powerful. And at Grads of Life, you know, we see this as a tremendous moment of opportunity for significant impact. So just to round out this part of the conversation, here is a quick summary of some of the major trends that we're seeing that are contributing to this kind of new paradigm. And I've touched on a number of these already, but so looking at the shift in the balance of power between workers and employers, a real emphasis on new commitments, both philanthropic commitments that companies are making, as well as re-examining what's happening inside their four walls. We're seeing increased interest in data, and like I said, more transparency, and a push for companies to kind of share more with their stakeholders around their DE&I data. And lastly, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, we're seeing coalitions of companies that are coming together. 110 is one example. There are actually several examples of groups of companies that are coming together, not just to make a big commitment, but also to learn from each other and actually exchange best practices and ideas and tips from each other to sort of accelerate that impact. So what I'd love to do now is take a pause and really actually hear from you all. So these are some of the things that, again, in our work, we're seeing and that we believe are really creating this new environment around DE&I. But what I'd love to invite you to do is chime into the chat, share with us what other trends are you seeing in your work that are contributing to this new landscape? What pressures are you feeling maybe in your own organization? Or what have you observed as you think about and reflect on the last year and what has changed? And since we are quite a big group today, I will ask anyone who'd like to come off mute and chime in live, if you could just raise your hand, use the little raise hand button. I would love to get one or two folks really chiming in here to share your thoughts. I will take a look here. So again, the question is, what trends are you seeing? What would you add to this list? What factors or contributors are shifting the way companies are thinking about DE&I? So I see a comment here about diversifying leadership. Yep, certainly resonates with us, right? Because the challenge is not just a hiring one, but thinking about advancement and retention and what it looks like to get an executive team that's diverse. Other thoughts? I don't see anyone currently with, no brave souls with their hands raised yet. Oh, I think I see, I do see one. Lindsay. Yeah, I invite Lindsay. Would love for you to come off mute and share your perspective with us.
Hi there. A trend that I noticed was the tension between leadership's awareness of what's going on, some processes that needed changing and growing, and their ability to make those changes. Mm-hmm. So I was working at a place where I built my DEI vocab and muscles quite a bit. I'm a white woman who was working in close proximity to leadership. And so I used my voice quite often to call in opportunities for growing and learning and resourcing and having just more trauma-informed language and better practice. And their ability and willingness to do it and embrace that wasn't really there. Like, it was really hard work for them to look in the mirror. And so that was a trend I noticed of, like, there's a willingness to engage in the work at an intellectual level, but taking it to action sometimes can be tougher for folks who have done it a certain way for a long time.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing, Lindsay. And that really resonates with us too. Often we'll have conversations at the leadership level, and then we'll do interviews of employees and get their experience. And the perception is very different, right? And there might be one perception of kind of the practices and policies that leadership has, and then employees are actually experiencing something very, very different. And we're going to get into what some of those key action steps might look like to go beyond kind of a commitment and actually put it into practice. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm going to ask Stacy to come off mute and share your perspective, and then Robin, and then we will move on. So Stacy, love to hear from you. And it looks like you're on mute, so you might need to unmute yourself. Yep. Oops, you muted yourself again, I think.
Okay, how about now? I should be good.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. I'm an HR business partner at Share Our Strength, and I'm a nonprofit organization. And what I'm definitely seeing is definitely the accessibility for hybrid workforce for our younger employees and for our more entry-level positions. That's something that, coming into, and just not in this organization, but many organizations that I worked for before, a lot of the younger generation coming into your first job hadn't really had that opportunity to work from home. It's all about the trust. It was more about, just getting your feet wet. And I think that now in terms of equity and in terms of having folks on the same playing field and being able to work from home and getting that trust and taking autonomy of their positions, I think that's been a great change. And also just the remote force in general before the pandemic and before some trends that we saw was that the remote satellite folks in our other offices weren't feeling like they were a part of our office, our headquarter office. And I think we've found ways, or tried to find ways, to kind of be equal all across the board and find new initiatives to engage and have these employees heard. And I think so far it's been going great. It just being able to have everyone have a hybrid workforce and playing on the same field. I've definitely seen that as a DEI trend all across, and even from our interns, that has been something big. Now our virtual internships are everywhere, which was not before. So that I think that has definitely been a great change.
Stacy, thank you so much for sharing. That is an undeniable, huge element of this shift is remote work. And I think what we've seen is that there's a lot of opportunity, and there's some level of risk, right? To really continue to build an equitable strategy in the remote environment requires additional considerations and thoughts. And we actually just published some research on that I'll talk about in a few minutes as well. Thank you so much for sharing. And Robin, would love to hear from you next.
Okay. I think one thing that companies or executives are having to come to terms with, or trying to figure out, what is the balance with dealing with those employees that are resistant to change. I know that there's been research to say that you shouldn't force DEI interventions or trainings on people that are resistant to change, because it will make them more closed off. But I will tell you, as a healthcare provider, knowing that the disparity rates are so high for minorities. For me, I have a concern with how that actually will play out in the lives of those clients that are getting care. If you have employees that are resistant to looking at their own biases and really changing their practice, at the end of the day, the people that are going to be the most affected are probably the clients that are being served. So as an organization, I personally wouldn't want people working for me who don't want to change, because it then will affect the clients that are being served. But if the current literature is saying that that's not best practices, how do you grapple with that? And then on top of that, for me, it feels like for those that are resistant to change, what it does is it gives them leverage and not having to really put their hands to the plow to do the work. So I find that really concerning, and I'm hoping that today you'll share some insight into what does that look like for people that are resistant to change, and how organizations are being told, well, don't push them, you know.
Thank you so much, Robin. And you've hit on a very, I would say, important, but also can be tricky to navigate challenge there. And my short answer would be, it's all about accountability and sort of goal setting for employees. So how are you thinking about weaving DE&I metrics and goals into your accountability structures for managers, for their performance reviews, and so that you're building in those incentives for them to sort of want to think differently over time. But that's a short answer. There's probably a much longer conversation on this. And in the interest of time, I'm gonna keep us moving. I know we could have spent a full hour just diving in further there, but I do want to shift gears now and share with you some of the findings from our latest research. And so with all of that shifting DE&I landscape as kind of the backdrop, we really have been getting so many questions from our clients, from our partner employers about, well, how do I take action, right? And hearing that it's actually quite confusing to try to piece together all of the literature and read all the articles to understand what actually has evidence. And so we're partners with Bain and Company, who are also supporters of the 110 Coalition, and they have been hearing a lot of similar things from partner companies, right? Just a kind of a general confusion and an inability to kind of process through what the research says. And so our goal was to really do a review of the research and come up with a short list of actions that have a significant amount of evidence behind them for driving outcomes. And so we did a review of over 100 research sources, predominantly academic literature, but we also drew on our own experiences. Again, having worked with companies for several decades, wanted to make sure that we were bringing our own perspective in as well. And what we came up with was 10 specific actions really shown to move the needle on at least one of the 4 outcomes that you see on the screen. So improved recruitment and hiring of diverse or underrepresented talent, increased levels of representation, increased feelings of engagement and belonging, critically important and part of the theme of the whole day today, and increased rates of retention and internal promotion. And we found, a couple of really interesting findings through this. So one, these 10 actions really emerged to the surface as those with kind of the most robust evidence base currently. And that doesn't mean that they're the only 10 actions that are important from a DEI perspective, but again, when trying to prioritize and think about kind of how do I have limited time, limited resources, where do I go to just get that quick list of things that I know are going to move the needle? The second thing we found is that about half of those practices are not common yet in corporate America, so they're not yet mainstream. The other half are quite common already, but still have kind of nuances to get to a better implementation. And I'll talk more about this when I show the practices in a moment. And then the third major finding was that there's a lot of complementarity between practices. So if you implement one, but not in partnership with another practice, or really most of the practices, you don't see as positive outcomes. So in other words, the more of these actions that you do in tandem together, the more likely you are to see these positive outcomes versus sort of choosing one and focusing really, really closely on one, but missing some of the others. And so before I share those 10 practices, and we're gonna double click on 3 of them, I wanna share with you our perspective on what it means to have a holistic approach to DE&I. And so our belief, and we share this with Bain, is that you have to really think wide and deep about your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and your strategy. And so we have a 5-pillar framework that we believe kind of spans all key areas of the business. And it's essential to think about each of these areas if you want to see the strongest outcomes. And so I think a lot of DE&I kind of historically has been focused on this equitable talent journey pillar, which is all about hiring, retention, and advancement. And then a little bit in inclusive culture, right, around what is that employee experience. Both critically important pillars, but we would argue that without these other 3, will only get you so far, right? And so pillar 1, strategy, governance, and accountability, that is really one of the most researched and sort of strongest, one of the strategies that has the strongest evidence base is what are those governance systems that you're setting up to ensure that your DEI strategy is success. So things like having a cross-functional task force of people, of different stakeholders within the business to kind of keep the company accountable for DE&I goals. It's also about resource allocation. What does your budget look like? How many people are you, full-time employees, are you sort of allocating to take to ownership of your DEI strategy? So again, without this pillar, it's really hard to get to these positive outcomes. Equitable talent journey, we talked about all the key actions in kind of recruitment, hiring, retention, and advancement. Family sustaining wages and benefits really kind of underpins all of this work, right? So if you don't have kind of the living wages and benefits that allow people to show up and bring their full selves to work and get to and from work healthily and happily, you're going to see a lot of kind of downstream consequences. Inclusive culture, we talked a little bit about, and then external engagement is an area that I think is growing in importance. And this is really about how companies are engaging with their suppliers and extending their commitment to DE&I through their supplier relationships, as well as engagement with consumers and the public more broadly. And so here are the 10 actions that we highlight in this report. And the actions on the top, so 1 through 5, are those that, as I mentioned, are not yet common in corporate America. So we did a whole analysis around kind of adoption, right, and kind of pervasiveness of these practices. And what we found is that these still are not that mainstream. The practices on the bottom, 6 through 10, we find a lot of companies are already doing these things. And so that said, when we looked at the research on each of these actions, there are a lot of nuances and things that can make them even better in implementation that we call out in the report. So for example, mentoring, about 70% of companies have some kind of mentoring program in place. Far fewer have formal sponsorship programs. So this is the really important difference of mentoring, which is more about kind of giving advice. It's a little bit more informal versus sponsorship, which is about really taking a commitment to advocate for someone's career development. And again, when we think about those outcomes in terms of the advancement of underrepresented talent, something like sponsorship and the difference between sponsorship and mentorship is critically important. I want to double click into 3 key actions today. And I've chosen 3 that are on the uncommon side of things, because I think it's really interesting to think about why they're not yet common. And I've also chosen 3 that are particularly important for the opportunity youth talent pool. And I know a lot of members of this community are really invested in youth And we at Grads of Life care deeply about youth and opportunity youth. And so I wanted to highlight a few strategies that are particularly important for this stakeholder group. So let's start with adopting a skills-first approach to talent acquisition. So this is a huge priority, I would say, in the business community right now. This is a significant area of focus for that 110 coalition that I mentioned. It's also a key area of focus at the Business Roundtable. And we're just seeing a tremendous amount of momentum around this topic. And so what does it really mean? Skills-first hiring is all about shifting from essentially an education attainment-based approach of screening candidates to a skills-based approach, where you're rethinking job descriptions and really asking, what are the skills and competencies needed to be successful in this job, instead of relying on a degree, a four-year degree often. And we think this is absolutely foundational to any DE&I strategy. And the reason for that is, when you require a four-year degree, you're right out the bat, right at the beginning, automatically excluding 3/4 of Black Americans. And I think it's up to 80% of Latinx talent as well. And so you're essentially saying from the beginning, I'm going to just completely contract my prospective talent pool, which is really hard to reconcile with a goal to diversify your workforce, right? So this is one of those really critical foundational practices. And it's also just proven to find better matches between prospective talent and the job. So we've done some research on how predictive is the college degree of job performance. And it turns out it's really not a very good predictor of job success. So skills and competencies are really what predict performance more than anything else. Not going to go into a ton of detail here because I know we're going to run out of time, but this is a pretty significant shift to make for most companies. And it's really all about going through your job descriptions and making sure that they're skills-based. It's about creating the right sourcing strategy to go along with that, which I'll talk about next. And it's also about really educating and helping your hiring managers understand the value of being a skills-based workforce. So we heard a little bit earlier about that internal resistance to change. I think this is a practice where a lot of change kind of thoughtful process and change management and helping employees understand kind of the value of this is really needed. And I want to mention that IBM is a really great example of a skills-first employer. They've been doing this work for a long time and have implemented really all of these adoption considerations in the middle column here. And about 50% of their jobs currently do not require a four-year degree. So they're really quite far along in making this shift and have a lot of great resources about how they've done that. I want to talk now about work-based experiences, a topic that I imagine a lot of you are familiar with already. But if you're not, work-based experience is essentially a way for a prospective employee to gain skills while also getting a paycheck. And so this most commonly occurs as an internship or an apprenticeship and sort of an earn and learn concept. And I think there's a couple really interesting things about work-based experiences in our country. The first is that when you compare the US to other countries, we have really a pretty small system of apprenticeship or of work-based experience. It's not something that has sort of scaled nationally compared to Switzerland or Germany or other countries that have really invested in a work-based experience model. In the US, it's really kind of manufacturing and skilled trades and certain industries that have really embraced the apprenticeship model. But we would argue that it's a lot of companies are not necessarily kind of realizing the value that they could of work-based experiences. And the other interesting thing is that they're not necessarily a new concept, right? So a lot of companies do have some sort of internship, but often those placements are reserved for college students or other candidates of master's degree programs. And so this ties back to the skills-based hiring action, in that we think it's really important, like having a university hiring program or university intern program, to also have in every company a kind of a pre-baccalaureate or a skills-based hiring work-based experience that is open to candidates that don't necessarily have that 4-year degree. And again, critical, randomized control trial studies of programs like Year Up have shown that these types of work-based experiences lead to significant wage gains for diverse talent over a long career trajectory. And in the interest of time, I am going to move us along to the next one, but I do want to call out that Wegmans is a great example of a company that has been doing this for several decades and really has seen business benefits from it. So I put a couple of stats around the kind of reduction in turnover and the cost savings that they've seen from work-based experiences. So this is not just about a charitable action for talent, it's really a business driver as well. The last action I want to share with you today is creating skills-based career pathways for all. And this is kind of an interesting one, because I think most companies think that, inherently you have career pathways, you have opportunities for everyone to advance. But often that information is kind of implicit or isn't necessarily made transparent to your employees, and employees don't necessarily know what are the various pathways where I can advance from where I am now. And this is particularly important for diverse talent. We know that Black workers are overrepresented in low wage frontline work. And so, creating the structures and the kind of systems to enable mobility is critically important. This is also, not something where you have to have a hierarchical kind of rigid structure where you only have one career path, right? It's really just about articulating the skills and competencies that are needed to get to various different points within the organization that actually lead to kind of wage growth and career mobility. So some people think about career lattices, which is a slight variation on career paths, which just means it's not necessarily, a one size fits all hierarchical path. But how do you move around the organization? It might be lateral moves, it might be to different business units, and making sure that you're really clearly articulating that. We love Chipotle for this action, which publishes on their website, some of you may have seen, really clearly the career path and the increase in salary that you get with every step that you take. And so just love the level of transparency and clarity that's, even if you're just looking for a job, if you go work at Chipotle, you know exactly what the steps are that you would take to get to a higher salary, and the title that you'd be looking at in order to grow. So one more kind of set of data to share with you on that point. We recently surveyed over 500 young diverse workers on their experiences shifting to remote work at the height of the pandemic, and asked them kind of how they felt their employers were supporting them. And one of the overarching insights from this research was a lack of awareness, a lack of information about career advancement opportunities. So this goes to the point from the previous slide around, it's not just about kind of mapping those paths, but it's about active and repeated communication with employees so that they understand what those options are, and they're able to actually think about how they get the skills needed to progress. So really, if there are a couple of takeaways from today, I think transparency around career paths is a really, really critical one. And we were going to do a poll, but I'm going to check in with with my colleague Hiba to confirm that I think from a time perspective, we should go just to a couple of questions from the audience. And then we will probably just close out in a couple of minutes here. So I'm gonna sort of close the presentation part of this, and I want to just open it up to a couple of questions in the last 5 minutes or so here. And so I will do my best to scan the chat. Carlos, yes, we can definitely make this presentation available.
And Laura, I believe Arslan has raised his hand.
Great, Arslan, feel free to come off mute and share your question with us.
Yeah, hey Laura. So this is Arslan. I work at Microsoft. So I think like the previous slide about the 10 actions with strong DEI outcomes was great. I think my question is more around regarding how we can track progress around those actions. So how do employers ensure that they're making progress and at the same time, like tracking what tactics are giving the most ROI? So what would you suggest is the best way to do that?
It's a great question. And I think this is kind of the next frontier in this movement, is essentially like effective impact and outcomes measurement. And we're thinking a lot about this at Grads of Life, and actually building a model, essentially a framework for employers to think about, okay, if you invest in these 10 actions, how do you track outcomes over time? And I'm happy to share more with you offline, but I think the highest level is, you know, you should be thinking about your investment in these actions and then looking over time at outcomes for employees. So how does this meaningfully affect things like wage growth, career development, and lived experience, and tracking those through obviously raw data, as well as employee engagement surveys. Impact to the business. So what is the ROI from a business perspective? Looking at cost savings in your recruiting, looking at reduction in turnover, and a few other kind of key metrics from a business perspective. And then we also like to encourage companies to think about trying to quantify and measure impact to community and society more broadly. So I know we don't have time for a thorough answer there, but I would think about how can you bucket your metrics into those 3 categories? And if you can't get to the society level, at least think about impact to employee and impact to the business. And then also really making sure that you're always connecting your outcomes to your overarching DEI ambition and goals. So the goals that you have as a company for improving representation, connecting those outcomes and those metrics always back to those foundational goals. Hope that's helpful. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I wish that we had more time because there's just so much wisdom in the group, and I'd love to have more of a dialogue with you all. But I do want to just close with a couple of kind of recommendations, which would be to access our 2 recent research papers. If you want more information, if you're looking to go practice by practice with that list that we shared and get insights on how do you actually implement these, what is the data that the research shows, encourage you to look on either our website at Grads of Life or on Bain's website, and you'll find all the information there. We also have a tool on Bain's website that helps you assess your progress within each of those 10 practices. So it's like a little mini assessment. It's totally anonymous, and you'll get recommendations if you take that survey for what you might be able to do differently. And then I think it's just always important to remember that you know, there's no right or wrong in terms of where you are now. Every company, every organization, it sounds cheesy to say, but is on its own journey with these strategies. And I think what we're really, really committed to and excited about is making it more transparent, kind of what that evidence says and how you can factor it into your strategy going forward. So would love to have conversations with you offline. I encourage you to reach out directly to me if you have further questions or thoughts. And I want to remind everybody that we have a quick break now, I think for 10 minutes. And the next sessions will begin at 2:40 Eastern time. So you can kind of sign off for now and then hop back into the next set of sessions at 2:40. And thank you all again so much for joining us today.